record to this computer. I've literally never done this before. Well, welcome, Iain, and welcome, dear friends, to an extended Q&A with the author of this wonderful book, The Matter with Things. Iain, thank you for writing. I don't think I've ever read a book that begins with
very welcome
and ends with Lucifer. So who knows where we'll go today? We've really enjoyed reading it. And we've been reading here in Cambridge and around the country for the past term. Let's get into it, I suggest. Friends in the chat, if you want to put a question in the chat or just raise a hand, I'll try to curate that. But why don't we get into it, Iain? So I suggest we start with questions 1 to 3.
Yep.
And here we go. So I'll read it, and perhaps you could respond. So the first question is about the preliminaries. In chapter 1, how we got here, you sort of, well, you say this, you put forward a hypothesis of how and why the mammalian and ultimately human hemispheric system evolved to its present form. And all I can say is that I know of no competing hypothesis that explains so many of the facts as we know them. And I'd like to start with a view to the best of a bad bunch objection to inference to the best explanation, critiques of the Panglossian paradigm of adaptationist forms of explanation, and the recent rise of cultural evolutionary psychology. We just had a general question, really, about how important to you are the details and the contours of the, I've called it a just so story, about the origins of the hemispheres that you tell in the preliminary chapter. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'd say that first of all, I think I'd clarify that what I'm referring to there is the part of what I suggest about the division of the hemispheres in relation to attention. That is my contribution, if you like. Most of the rest of the story in that chapter about how the brain evolved to have these 3 pairs of opponent processes, the cortex versus the subcortical regions, the left versus right, and the frontal pole with its oppositional relationship with the posterior cortex. That is all just taken from mainstream science. So that is what is currently said. Now, science is always in evolution. So I make and I'm particularly myself temperamentally disinclined to make any absolute truth claims, which is absolutely not the same, of course, as saying I don't think some things are truer than others. So my claim about the attentional division has an enormous amount going for it. I mean, it's not infallible. It's not suggested that it is, but we do know from the current behavior of birds and animals that there is this attentional difference. And when you attend differently, you achieve a different version of the world. And all this is entirely coherent with the hemisphere theory. So it's got a lot going for it, I'd say. It's not necessarily the best of a bad lot. It might just be the most fitting at the moment. I was just thinking, interestingly, that even going back to trilobites, we see that they have more bites on their right side of the body and fewer on the left, which is interesting because the left side of the body would be controlled by the right side of whatever ganglion was in operation. And would have been the one that was on the lookout for predators. So going all the way through history, there is this distinction of attention. It's pretty foundational.
Thank you. I'm just struggling to take the, here we go, spotlight. I suggest we move on to chapter 2. Question 2.
Okay.
It's a question that is arising from the chapters on perception and judgment. And it's, in a word, it's about depression. And the question is basically, why don't high depression rates cut against the hemisphere hypothesis. So I'll read the question because it begins with two framing quotes. So in chapter 3 on perception, you say that whereas in schizophrenia, the right frontal lobe is underactive, and responsibility for one's thoughts, actions, and moods is not accepted but projected, but outwards onto others. In depression, the right frontal lobe tends to be relatively overactive compared with the left. Subjects are overwilling to accept responsibility. So you contrast schizophrenia with depression and a lateralized effect. In chapter 4, you say on judgment, the right hemisphere takes a more pessimistic view of the self, and it is also more realistic about it. After all, it is the one with insight. There is a large literature on this topic, but a fair summary, although there are different views, is that depression has repeatedly been shown to be associated with greater realism. So here's the question. With high depression rates in the UK, US, and elsewhere, why doesn't that line up against your hemisphere hypothesis? In short, if depression is a reflection of the right hemisphere's attitude to the world and the self, in contrast to the over-optimistic, overconfident left hemisphere, but today's society has more the character of a left hemisphere mindset, doesn't that seem inconsistent with the reports that depression rates are at unprecedented levels? So there's a question we had as a group.
Yes. No, I agree that on the surface that appears to be problematic. I think there are several points I'd make. The first is that unlike schizophrenia, although there are different types of schizophrenia, depression is remarkably heterogeneous. So the term depression is used in popular parlance in a different way from the way in which I was intending it here, which is a psychiatric disorder called major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder is only a small part of those who are broadly classified as depressed. So a lot of those who are currently said to be depressed and found to be depressed on population inventories and so on are not, the majority of them will not be fulfilling criteria for major depressive disorder at all. They will be a mixture of people who are anxious, stressed, and so forth. These conditions, if they have any hemisphere correlates, I don't know them. I don't believe they do. They're too amorphous, they're too general, and they don't really add up to anything specific. When I'm talking about major depressive disorder, I'm talking about a very, very special and serious condition in which people do become completely, at times, obsessed with the idea that they've caused terrible things to happen to their family, or in extreme cases, that they may have, for example, I had a patient who believed that she'd started the war in Bosnia. So this is a very different thing from your average stressed, anxious, pessimistic person. I think the next thing to say is that, unfortunately, even in the case of the more clear-cut kind of depression, it can be caused by two imbalances. And this is perhaps not easy to say, it would be easier to draw. But if you imagine that the right frontal pole is in an oppositional relationship, an equilibrium, with both the left frontal pole and the anterior cortex. So if you remember, I begin by saying that the brain broadly has these three opponent processes, top to bottom, side to side, and front to back. And so what opposes the right frontal cortex is the left frontal cortex on the side to side axis and the right posterior cortex on the front to back axis. So what this means is that either deficiencies in the left frontal lobe or in the right posterior cortex, which is probably at least as much of what happens when we're not using our right hemisphere, if you like, it would cause this condition. Now, as I've said, I'm not saying that this condition is a common one, it's a rather special one, but even when it is, it can be schematically underwritten in these two ways. I should stress that this is all very schematic. It's a bit sort of simple-minded. I put it forward in order to give something that is not over complex and would collapse into the impossibility of making any general statement. But I think, as well as that, it's fair to say that would we not have probably all agreed to this? I don't know. That there is a difference between the sort of mindset and the way that business leaders, politicians, Silicon Valley plutocrats and so forth view the state of things, and the way the rest of us, ordinary people, see it. As of course there was in 1984 and in Brave New World, a distinction between the optimistic opinion leaders and the rest of suffering humanity. They often seem to exude a sort of fatuous optimism in the face of mounting evidence of impending disasters of many kinds. So they appear to be driven by this blind, cheerful optimism of the left hemisphere, leaving us to an increasing sense of hopelessness. I don't know if that helps at all.
Maybe I could push a little bit further on, because one of the reasons I think it's interesting to put the two quotes on, there was one from the Perception and one from the Judgment chapter, was because it wasn't just the depression, which I hear you say, look, say the DSM, that's got a very specific meaning. And I'll defer to your professional understanding on that. But the pessimistic outlook sounded quite broad. And
it is.
That sort of...
that's driven by
sort of broad thing that might be measured by what folk psychology or folk on the street would say depression.
Yes, you're right, and that evidence comes from many sources, but one is from being able to interrogate one hemisphere at a time about itself, and some ingenious psychologists took advantage of something called the WADA test, which is sometimes administered prior to neurosurgery, in which you, for 15 to 20 minutes at a time, knock out one hemisphere at a time to discover which one controls speech. And in doing so, it gave them the opportunity to offer a personality inventory to each hemisphere independently and to families of the subject. And what they found was that the families and friends felt that the left hemisphere on its own took a remarkably gung-ho, optimistic and overconfident view about itself, whereas the right hemisphere took a more, perhaps a little bit on the negative side, but just a great deal more realistic. And generally speaking, when people are depressed, they don't get deluded by strange beliefs that all is going to be absolutely fine after all. Now, I'd say that the general populace at the moment is divided between those who think, oh, we'll do it all fine, and just give technology a chance and we'll sort it all out. But those who are more sort of right hemispheric tend to be the ones who are more empathic towards the suffering natural world and so on. And these people tend to a rather pessimistic outlook. I don't think that I'd want to make an enormous amount out of it, but it seems to me to not be a stumbling block, really. But tell me if you think it still is. Yes.
Sorry, is that, yeah, thank you very much, Iain. So something on that I don't know if you want to comment on or not. There seems to me, when you're talking about responsibility, that certainly from what I remember being told as a wee lad, there seems to be less appetite for accepting personal responsibility for little things, or holding our children responsible for their behavior, etc. And yet, on a larger scale, there's a bigger sort of acceptance of accepting responsibility, so taking responsibility for our ancestors and what they did, or things of the past, or things done in our name, etc.
Yes.
I'm not necessarily saying there's something on that, but it seems where, when you're talking about how the right hemisphere accepts responsibility more than others,
Yes.
and more
Yes.
the left, I wonder if that skews with scale or anything like that. I don't know.
No, I think it's a very, very good point. Thank you very much. Sorry, I don't know everyone's names, but you are
Nathan, thank you.
Nathan. Nathan, thank you very much, Nate. So, what I would reflect on that is that definitely during my lifetime and compared with my parents' generation, their parents' generation, we seem very much less willing to accept personal responsibility. There's a general outsourcing of responsibility to other social groups, to the government or whoever, rather than taking responsibility for one's own life. So I think that shift away from taking responsibility is part of the drift away from a truly grounded right hemisphere position. And of course, the business about blaming, taking responsibility for one's ancestors is something one can't do. One can't apologize for or take responsibility for one's ancestors. Apart from anything else, it's ridiculous for us to sit in judgment on them. One doesn't know what, I mean, we only have, in popular parlance, extremely crude ideas about what their motivations and so on were. So I think that's just another example of outsourcing responsibility and saying somebody else was to blame. So I think as a society, we're constantly looking for scapegoats and other groups to take responsibility. And there's a sort of narcissistic entitlement that nobody should blame me, nobody should threaten me, nobody should take an opinion I don't agree with. And I think that's utterly lamentable and would be part of the picture of the way the world is drifting that I'm painting.
Thank you. I want to sit with this question for a little bit because there have been two follow-up questions in the chat. So I'll be conscious of time. And of course, on a day where we've got holidaymakers flying in droves to Greece and Greece is on fire, we should be alert to the paradoxes of our time. But we have a question from Antonios. Antonios, do you want to just voice that?
Sure, and I just want to say it's 15 degrees here in Sydney. It's very cold.
It is your winter.
It is. We're in the middle of winter.
That's about as warm as it gets in the summer in Skye. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've always thought that the sort of the higher levels in the West of depression, not not the pathology, the generalized depression, just the general sort of sense of depression, is due to kind of disconnection between people, due to technology and the pace of life,
Absolutely.
Due to a lack of meaning because things are more logical. And I'm just wondering, how does that map onto the left brain, right brain dichotomy? And perhaps that explains why it's so much more common now.
No, beautifully. I mean, I think that's absolutely spot on. I mean, what I would say is that our discontent is one of having lost any sense of meaning, purpose, or direction in our lives. And there are three, I would say, broad elements involved in that. One of them I alluded to at the end of the Master and his Emissary, which is the need to belong to a coherent social group that has common values, common purposes, tends to share lives in the sense of being in one another's houses, having shared meals, having shared rituals. That seems to be extremely important for human flourishing. And anomie, as Durkheim called it, this feeling of sort of there being no rules, no principles, no containment is anxiety inducing. The second is being in and close to nature, and compared with perhaps even 100 years ago, never mind 200 years ago, there's been a colossal disconnect between the natural world and the way most people now live. And we just know that spending time in nature, simply even half an hour, but being attentive, not attending to your phone, but actually being present, being mindful, perhaps meditating, but being around and connected with nature enormously increases various things, a sense of psychological well-being. Over the long run, it actually increases physical well-being. It certainly increases spiritual connection. And it also decreases things like anger and cognitive dysfunction. And the third is spirituality. The third is that connection with a realm beyond what everyone likes to call it, a sense of the divine or the sense of the sacred, as I call it. And that seems to be absolutely fundamental to human flourishing. And I give the evidence for that and for the connection with the natural world towards the end of the matter with things. So I would say that if you really wanted to make people maximally unhappy, you do what we've done, remove them from nature, destroy a coherent culture, and tell them that the spiritual is a fantasy.
Can I just say quickly, I read somewhere that there are many children growing up in cities today where the light pollution is so bad that they'll reach adulthood without ever having seen a single star.
Whether or not that's a precise claim, I don't know. But I mean, broadly speaking, it's absolutely correct. It's harder and harder to be in touch even with that kind of natural experience. So, yeah.
It's okay. I think I'll just draw stumps on that question, Sarah. We've got another one in the chat. We could run on this. This could take us back into Oliver Sacks and Tolkien's poem Mythopia. He sees no stars. But if it's okay, I think I'll move on to question 3, which perhaps we've begun to touch on, which is sort of a methodological question, really. So it's with respect to chapter 9, what schizophrenia and autism can tell us. You ask a fascinating question. Is it conceivable that elements of the way of being in the world embedded in a culture might start to resemble one hitherto largely confined to the mentally ill? And if you like, I'd like to turn this round. The questioner says in his 1978 essay, The Trouble with Functionalism, Ned Block once considered the merits and pitfalls of conceiving the whole of China, for example, as a functioning mind. How far do you think the insights of a neuropsychological gestalt that, as you say, is based on the structure of our brains, can or ought to be extended, can be extended or ought to be, where arguably our brains don't? Do you thoughts on that question?
Yeah.
Sort of, another way of putting it might be, there's a way of speaking about hemispheres as left and right, but also hemispheres as west and east. Yes. Perhaps we shift very quickly.
Yes. I mean, in the Master and his Embassy, on that particular point, I do slightly resile from the idea that the West is left and the East is right in terms of hemispheres, but it is broadly more true, or was, until Xi, or even perhaps Mao, came to be the principal leader of the Chinese. But in any case, there is something in that. There's a reflection made by Whitehead, which I think is very interesting, that a culture is in its finest flower until it starts to analyze itself. Now, if a culture can analyze itself, it can think about itself. And I think cultures do think about themselves, and in doing so, they are offered all the ways of thinking that a person is offered. So it's not such a bizarre idea that a culture should espouse certain ways of thinking that are associated with the left hemisphere, or those associated with the right. But, I mean, thinking in that very explicit sense is a rather special case of what the hemispheres are doing all the time, much of it not sort of explicit at all. It's only one rather specialized thing we do with our brains. And built into the idea of each hemisphere's take on the world is that there are certain values or purposes that are associated with a whole way of being in the world. And once you're talking about a whole way of being in the world, which is what I would see the hemispheres as representing rather than merely a process of thought, it becomes increasingly artificial to distinguish between an individual and a culture, and indeed might even be a mistake in itself to distinguish too sharply between an individual that emanates from a culture, is formed by that culture, and helps in turn to form the culture that it originates in or from. So I think that I don't see that there's really a problem here, although I know that the form of words suggests that there must be a problem. But I think this would all be much easier for us if we lived in an era where it was easy to draw on both hemispheres equally. So in a world where we lived closer to nature, where there was a coherent cultural heritage, where we lived in a more fully embodied way, where the arts spoke to us in visceral, in imaginative terms rather than in clever intellectual terms, and where we were more open to the divine or the sacred, I think that the question almost wouldn't arise because we would be balancing these things. But in the world that we now live in, which, as I say, disrupts that for us, and in which culture is largely a matter of talking heads in public debate about questions, we're more likely to slip into a left hemispheric way of thinking, partly because it's much easier to articulate the left hemisphere's point of view for two reasons. One, it's very simple compared with the right hemispheres. And secondly, it doesn't require the use of metaphor, poetry, narrative, myth, and so on in order to make its points. It can simply say, well, you know, what you said before, it is paradoxically in conflict with what you're saying now. And in our modern era, it's worse to have contradicted yourself than it is to have made a perfectly non-contradictory statement that's flatly false. So everyone is keen not to contradict themselves, but this unfortunately means that we get into a very simple way of thinking about the world, because if you begin to really cognize its deep structure, as I suggested at the beginning of part 3, you're inevitably faced with what we, or the left hemisphere version of reality, calls paradoxical, in which something and its apparent opposite both need to be honored and held together at the same time without collapsing into one or the other.
Thank you. If I could just press it maybe slightly further, there'd be one way of reading your work that I've come across people having more sympathy with the view that, say, in Elizabeth Schechter's work on can we contain multiple thinking centers of consciousness, thinking parts of the brain, each of their own inner worlds. A lot of people are making sense of that. I think where people have sometimes found it difficult to get a hold of was in places where there's no obvious correlate to the actual hemispheres or something like the structure of a brain. And I suppose maybe there's a tu quoque reply, you know, embodied, extended cognition, inactive cognition, social, biosocial, psychological models often include the much more extensive way in which someone like Heidegger might have said Dasein is its world existingly. So maybe it's just a false choice here, but just to push back, some people have said this makes sense of having two inner worlds, if you like, within the structure of the brain. But for something like cultures, it's harder to see where the centers of embodied cognition are, and if there are there, how they track onto the structure of our brains. I'm just trying to articulate.
Well, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what the pointed issue exactly is, but what what I would say is that, yes, it has been and may well be difficult for people to make sense of different ways of thinking and points of view. But one of the things that I rather controversially feel I may have offered to philosophy is to say that where in the past we've had to say some people thought of things this way, some people thought of them that way, and then there was a swing the other way, and then there was another swing, and so on. And so over history, I can find groups of people who broadly thought like this, and groups of people who broadly thought like that. And we now don't have to just shrug our shoulders and go, well, and take your pick. They're both equal. They may not be equal, that's all. I mean, one of them may be more representative of the fallacies associated with the left hemisphere, which just is literally more prone to error.
Thank you. I think probably it's time to move on to the second tranche of questions. Three I'd really like to get into. And perhaps this is a case of me, a sort of AAA philosopher, pressing on points of equivocation. Did you mean this in this context? And context is absolutely crucial here.
Yes, it is.
But I'd like to move over what maybe is the smaller question about different ways of seeing the thing-process distinction when you're talking about truth. I'd like to move on to the question about the thing-process distinction in the science of life. So if I may, I'll just read this question, and it is a question about context, really. So in chapter 12, moving into part 2, the science of life, you quote John Dupre's 2017 saying, and I think the metaphysics of metamorphosis, that in the living world, at least, a metaphysics of things is hard to sustain. I guess this question is a three-parter. The first question is there a non-living world? You sometimes use that way of speaking in the book. Second part is, with respect to Dupre, he actually went on to provide a contrast in his way of thinking between two ways of thinking. And he said this: in the Western philosophical tradition, a thing has at least two key features. First, it's self-sufficient. Its existence depends only on its internal properties. Secondly, what requires explanation is when a thing changes, not when it stays the same. And he says life, and sometimes he says living organisms, conforms to neither of these conditions. But the worry is, here's the second part of the question: does anything satisfy those conditions? And if we can't think of anything that does satisfy those two conditions, then what use remains of the distinction? Would you care to comment on that? I think it's quite close to the heart of your book, The Matter with Things. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that I don't think that Dupre, well, in fact, I'm sure Dupre is not so much pointing up a distinction between the way some things are and the way that other things are, as the way in which physics and biology has conceived the world until quite recently, and the way that we are now obliged to think of it. So the two things he points to are the self-containedness and the stasis. So I think that, of course, he would say that what we're looking at in physics and biology is not things that are atomistically independent of everything else, nor static. They are actually always interdependent with other things and always in motion. So you're right that in a sense he's not making a distinction between two kinds of things, but what he is making a distinction between, and I think it's a very important one for him to have made, between the way in which physics and biology has conceived the world and the way in which we are now moving on to viewing it, which is in some ways the reverse. Instead of seeing motion as an aberration, which is when the stasis fails for some reason because it's been given a push, we see motion as fundamental and stasis as the unattainable endpoint of that continuum. And the same thing for interdependence. So that moves us to the next question. And I don't know, because I can't really speak for Dupre, whether he would go as far as I do, which is to say, I do accept that there is something we call the inanimate world, because we've got to make a distinction between life and, iron sulfate and a basalt rock and so on. So all these things have their uses. But ultimately, I espouse Robert Rosen's position, and I don't know that Dupre would thank me for taking him there, which is that inanimacy is just the limit case of life. It sounds extraordinary because we're used to thinking of the cosmos as largely inanimate and life as a freak. But there is a way in which the distinction, particularly if you're a panpsychist, which I am, and incidentally a panentheist, but maybe that doesn't matter at the moment. If you are a panpsychist, then the distinction between life and the inanimate is not to do with the presence or otherwise of consciousness, because consciousness is, the whole of the cosmos is steeped in consciousness or formed out of consciousness. And so consciousness is there. What distinguishes life from inanimacy is, I think, two things. One is it gives things a degree of permanence. So the idea of the table in front of me can come and go in a thousandth of a second, but the table will be here tomorrow morning, provided I'm not subject to a rather unusual form of burglary. So the table is relatively persistent because it's material. And the other thing it offers is resistance. And as you know, I argue that resistance is essential to creation. So matter has its role, but that life is really just the limit case. Sorry, that inanimacy is just the limit case of life. Does that help or not?
Chris, you're muted.
Sorry, that was an extremely rich response, Ian. Thank you. And yeah, for what it's worth, I recently met Philip Goyle at the European Conference for the Foundations of Physics, and we're going to have a conversation this week on some really interesting overlapping concerns here.
Yes,
and I think this will bring us into the panpsychist discussion later on in the Q&A. But I just wanted to pause if anyone else, I think that for what it's worth, that's elucidated something for me, that we're talking about a misrepresentation a mistake in the scientific image, perhaps, that maybe was a mistake of classical mechanical thinking in the 19th century. But does anyone want to come back on that before we move on? These thoughts are all pregnant with possible discussions. Well, there's a finger from Sarah, and William, feel free to pitch in if you want to. Sarah, do you want to ask? Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thanks. I hope this feels like a fruitful follow-up. Hi, Ian. I'm Sarah. Thank you.
Hello.
It's been great to discuss it. I suppose maybe I'd be interested, given what you've said and given this sort of reconceptualization of things, or even maybe doing away with the category of things. I'd be interested to hear you, maybe how you'd articulate your sense of boundaries for things. I think sometimes in the book it feels as though you're saying that boundaries between things are almost illusory. There are no boundaries, but you also lean very heavily on kind of the idea of gestalts, which kind of do need a boundary to have a form. I'd just be interested to hear you, maybe articulate how you would.
Yes. Yes. Well, I'd say that there is as often a problem of when I want to problematize a certain concept, that I want to entirely do away with it and substitute its opposite. There may be some more fruitful ground which holds both of these possibilities. So obviously there need to be boundaries. I'm a great believer in them in all aspects of life. And as a psychiatrist, they have particular meaning when it comes to the human mind and ego. So, but the idea that they are as rigid as they've often been thought to be is also a mistake. So, for example, one example that would be nice to take would be that of a human cell. So because of the way the human cell is represented in a textbook or in a microphotograph, it seems to be to have a very clear boundary, and it does in a way. But if you look at that boundary, it's actually fluid, and it's coming and going, and it's moving, and things are passing through it and out of it all the time. So that to think of the cell as entirely sort of separate from its surroundings is a mistake, because its surroundings are sometimes becoming it, and it's sometimes becoming its surroundings, and the two can't exist without one another. So they are a complex system as a whole. So I think the problem, as so very often, comes from the need to be too rigid, which I think is a left hemisphere tendency of a certain kind of philosophizing. And what I'm trying to get away from is that, and the idea that very obviously there is a much closer relationship between the cell and its immediate environment than there is between the cell and Mars. No dispute. But nonetheless, it is a matter of gradation. And so what I'm constantly trying to do is replace hard and fast with graded conceptions. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Do tell me if it doesn't.
It's good.
Okay, all right. No, fine, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. And I think we are well placed to move on to a question about, in part 3, in fact. Question 9 I'd like to move to, because you mentioned panpsychism, and a lot of us have an interest in these things. I have a paper in progress called Panpsychism, which maybe I'll send your way. Here's the question. In chapter 25, on matter and consciousness, you summarize a 7-point summary, so I'll read it if I may. 1, mind and matter have a close relationship. 2, we cannot logically dismiss the existence of consciousness. 3, we ought to be unwilling to dismiss the existence of matter. 4, they are not so distinct that they cannot interact. 5, neither are they identical. 6, they may be aspects of one and the same reality. Nonetheless, 7, they are not equal, in the sense that there is reason to believe that consciousness is prior ontologically to matter. Here's the question. Would you describe your view as a dual aspect monism, a neutral monism, or, given that photons have zero mass, a deeper form of dualism based on more fundamental fields? I personally was quite interested to hear you describe yourself as a panpsychist. There are lots of isms, and isms become wasms, don't they? But I'd just like to hear you think out loud a little bit about the way you see your position in part 3. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, yes, I'm a great believer that isms should be wasms, which is why I'm not sure that any of the particular labels apply necessarily to me, because, of course, there are different people in different positions under each of those labels. But I suppose the closest one would be dual aspect monism. And I stand by 1 to 6 of those points, and most of 7, except that I'm undecided as to whether I would say that consciousness is prior to matter, or whether I would say that consciousness and matter are simply different phases of the same thing. And here we come to the possible analogy of water. Water has different phases. It can be translucent and flowing and move easily across your hand. It can be cold and extremely hard and unmovable unless given a great push. That's called ice. And then in this room, there is a ton of water, which is what enables me to carry on living. So, but we don't see it. So all of those are water. And if you said which of those is water, some people would say, well, the stuff that flows, the others are kind of secondary. But really, in a way, that's not entirely logical. They're all water. None of them necessarily has priority, but I know what people mean when they say water is that flowing translucent substance. So to that extent, I would perhaps qualify what I say in 7. I wouldn't resile from it exactly, but I'm not sure that I'd say that consciousness is prior to matter, or just say that consciousness takes a number of forms, one of which is matter. What I think about the ontological question is that the one thing that we can be absolutely certain of, which is why it's hilarious that there are people who are paid professorial salaries to say the opposite. The only thing that we can be completely certain of is that there is consciousness. Matter, nobody has ever seen matter. All we know is that there are aspects of what we experience in consciousness that we call material. They have the quality to be associated with matter. Perhaps I should leave it there for the moment and see what the comeback is before I know which way to go now.
I mean, if I may, I think one of the most interesting things for me in reading your work is I think you're cutting across a number of contemporary discussions. I think the way you describe consciousness seems to be closer to subjectivity in some sense, and the way you describe matter as roughly what has mass interests me, because it makes, in other discussions, people don't set things up that way. And so photons are an interesting test case, because in a sense they have, in effective field theories, they have become zero mass. But does that mean it's massless, or is it of zero mass? So much might turn on how we construe matter, and for example,
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe I'll open it up to others. Yeah. But we have a cluster of questions.
Well, but hang on. May I first respond to what you've just said? Sure. Because you put 2 points, both of which I think are worth glossing before we go any further. My position is close to subjectivity. No, it isn't. Again, we're into this problem that if you problematize one thing, you must be saying the opposite. And that's why I lay out in the first, 12 pages of the book, at some length, my position, which is neither a sort of subjectivist nor a purely objectivist position. It's that whatever it is that we experience partly owes its nature for the time that it is experienced to the experiencer. But there is something there that is separate from the experiencer to the extent that it's not entirely created by the experiencer. So it is always an encounter with something other. And it's very hard because our language lets us down when we try to image this. But I think it's coherent to say that what I experience has something of me about it. The experiencer changes what is experienced. And but nonetheless, that what it is that is experienced is not just something fabricated by me. I'm very strongly opposed to that, and that is one of my bones of contention, if there is such a thing, between me and some idealists. For example, Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Kastrup, who believe that all we can do is read off an instrument panel inside our heads. The other one is about... I've forgotten what it was now. You went on to say there was subjectivity, and then you said...
Matter is what
Oh yes, matter is what has substance, has mass. I think that physicists will say that the term matter might need to be retired, because in quantum field theory, which I think is the most promising current theory espoused in physics, anything that we would normally think of as material has been superseded by the idea of a field of energy. And we call mass something that happens when certain fields collapse and can be more point-like, more atomistic. They take on that form. But that matter is not necessarily anything other than a version of a field of energy. And light is, of course, a field of energy. So let's leave it at that so that there's time for comeback and questions.
Yeah, thank you. And I would certainly say I didn't mean to attribute to you in using the word subjectivity, a sort of subjectivism that what you call mumbo. It was more the sort of shadow. But maybe I'll open up to others on this question. We have a cluster of questions about, Penny, for your thoughts on the hard problem, the notion of a world soul. There's a question in the chat from William about the combination problem in cosmopanpsychism and so on. But does anyone want to give voice to any of those questions?
Can't be all disowned.
Antonios?
Yeah, I think you've already answered the question of your position on the hard problem.
Okay.
It's a kind of a dual aspect monism, would you say?
Well, I'd say the hard problem is as hard as you set the problem up to be. And if you suggest that somehow we've got to get consciousness out of mind that has nothing of the nature of consciousness about it, then you've certainly got a hard problem. But that's because you set things up in an improbable way.
Yeah, I certainly think the hard problem is downstream from some ontological choices. I mean, personally, I was quite interested in your suggesting you're not quite so sure about point 7, because at some points in the book when we were reading that, we were not quite sure if you were offering a kind of conceivability argument against panpsychism, right? So if you have the view that can we think of consciousness without matter, it seemed to me the answer was a tentative yes. Can we conceive of matter without consciousness? No. That seemed to be a sort of, there's a way you could read that as a sort of knockdown against the panpsychist and the physicalist alike on some readings. So
I must be being a bit
that's a little
dense
quick
here. I mean, if matter can't be conceived of without mind, then but consciousness can be conceived of without matter. That's perfectly compatible with panpsychism.
It depends how you.
It would only be if matter was conceivable. If you posited that matter was something that had nothing of mind about it, then that would not be compatible with panpsychism. But that is not my position.
Sorry, could you say that again?
If you set it up that matter had nothing of mind about it, then that would be incompatible with panpsychism. But that is not my position.
Right. I mean, people will set this up differently, and perhaps, I mean, there's a way of thinking about panpsychism that sort of Strawson goes for. Galen Strawson as a sort of real physicalist position where, and some people work this out according to which the experiential or the proto-experiential conscious properties of matter are the intrinsic ones, and then the extrinsic structures are the instant what physics can discern. And if you have that sort of view, then depending how broadly you construe matter, the conceivability of consciousness without matter, if consciousness is the intrinsic nature of matter, there's a way of thinking of the conceivability of one without the other as either a form of neutral monism or a form of dualism. There are other ways of setting it up, but that was the thought.
Well, that's the way I'm setting it up. And what I'd like to say about Galen Strawson is that I'm a huge admirer of him. Yeah. And I rely on him, as you know, in chapter 25 quite a bit. But I do think, I do know what he means by real physicalism, and we have corresponded on it. But I do think that it can be a bit of a smokescreen, because real physicalism is okay as long as you set physical up to be not exclusive of psyche. And if you do, then that's fine. But then most people wouldn't call that, a kind of hard physicalism, that's all. So there's a kind of unease with his terminology, which seems to do more work than it ought to be allowed to do.
Yes, he's got this lovely phrase, physicsalism, which he's against.
Okay. It's all right.
If there's no further questions on that, I suggest we keep going. And thank you, Iain, for your time.
Okay.
So I suggest we just try and go to question 11 and question 12. Sarah, and our resident phenomenologist, do you want to give voice to this question, Sarah? It's sort of in your words. It's question 11 on chapter 27.
Can you read it out? Because I haven't got them in front of me. So.
Oh, yes, I can do. So this was in the chapter on purpose, life, and the nature of the cosmos. So it's a two-part question, and some of this came out of our discussion in the group together. So firstly, in one of the sections there in that chapter, you offer what kind of felt a little bit like analogies of kind of classic theologies, kind of in defense of a teleological worldview. So you give your case, your account for a teleological worldview, and there are at least two kind of arguments. One was there needs to be freedom in the system, which felt a little bit like a free will defense, maybe some version of that, and then an appeal to the existence of higher order goods. So you give your kind of your graphic examples of, there was like caterpillars whose stomachs explode with eggs or laid by predators or something, but as that needs to happen for the unfolding goodness of the whole. So firstly, kind of a question that we kind of reflected that it was interesting in terms of thinking of these as almost kind of like theodicies, that in the kind of more classic theodicy space or discussion, these have often been thought of as, well, in your thinking, maybe they're more left hemispheric, kind of defensive, whereas there's kind of space in that conversation to sort of be more open to mystery, or sort of not to be less kind of tidily explanatory. So it'd be interesting to just hear your thoughts on that. And then secondly, there was sort of potentially a moral worry. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on whether at some points in this chapter, it felt like you were saying what we almost like our orientation towards the unfolding of the cosmos should be kind of surrender to the whole at the expense of the parts, or that we need to have this sense that rather than worrying about what seems like bad design at the level of the parts, we sort of lift our gaze to the whole. And whether the sort of, is there a moral worry there in terms of sacrificing the parts for the whole, particularly I suppose if we're thinking about, well, at all kinds of fields, but particularly maybe in human communities. But so that's two questions. I'd be really interested in your thoughts.
Yes. Wow. Well, I'm not aware that in that chapter I'm offering, or anywhere in the book, that I'm offering a theodicy. All I can remember saying repeatedly is, NB, this is not an argument for an engineering God. So certainly not for an engineering God. I leave it sticking to the wall, whether there is or there isn't a God. And even in the chapter on the sense of the sacred, I spend a lot of time fending off unfortunate connotations of the word God. So I'm definitely not offering a theodicy. And the section of the chapter which includes the deeply worrying zombie ant fungus and other miracles of creation, is headed "Warning: Purpose may be bad for your health or damaging to your health" or something of the kind. So I'm making a bit of a joke that, don't think that this is all a picnic. Don't think that if there is purpose, it's all purpose to an end that you're going to like, at least at the local level. And what I'm trying to suggest is that people are so worried by the idea that if they accept purpose for a millisecond, they're entering into God, that they're willing to deny the most obvious evidence of purpose in nature. And many biologists accept, and particularly now, that we can't just hold on to the idea that it's just random variation until something pops up. And there are definitely hijackings of these processes to produce certain ends. So in my view, you're really on a sticky wicket if you suggest there isn't purpose. So then it's just a question of where that leaves us. And it doesn't leave us with a God who designed it all this way. But it doesn't deny the existence of a God. So that comes in the chapter 28. And there what I'm suggesting is that, and it's not an original argument, that either God controls everything, or there is room for things that are not planned by God. I mean, those are the only options. And I'm not suggesting that God controls everything. And I think there are rather few people who would now want to say that. But on the other hand, there may be a God who has purposes of a large nature, that God may be interested in the process of self-discovery, self-evolution even, in combination with the self-discovery and self-evolution of the cosmos that divine being is the ground of or underwrites. So if it's going to be a free system, then yes, there is going to be, it's free to do different things, and some of it will tend in a certain direction and some will not. But if you look at any complex system about which you can generalize its trends, you will always be able to find bits of the picture which look as though they're going in the opposite direction or going somewhere else altogether. And the trouble is that the more you zoom in, although we think that you'll see more, you see less. I mean, literally you see less, of course, the more you zoom in. But also you may understand the whole picture less. I mean, I think somewhere I do give the example of a painting by Monet. If you stand back from the painting, you see exactly what's going on. But as you get more and more into, if you magnify and magnify, you see contradictory splurges of colors that make no sense at all in either color or form. So there's a difference between the whole and the parts, but not at the expense of the parts or the disregarding of the parts, but just of there must be in this whole, if there are to be parts at all. And I'm afraid I think that parts are probably a misnomer, an artifact of left hemisphere analysis. So what I would say is that what looks like a part at one level is a whole at another, and so forth, a sort of nested holarchy, rather, as Arthur Koestler suggested. So yes, I think I hope I've to some extent answered your questions, but if not, then please tell me what you'd like further to discuss.
I don't know if anyone else wants to come back, or
Nathan, I know you might have thoughts on this.
Thank you. I was thinking theologically within the Christian tradition that the Christ event is the epitome of the universal particular part being willingly sacrificed for the sake of the greater, even the consummate good of the whole. And for me, this resolves the problem of the need for for death, for sacrifice, because it is part of the intrinsic logic of the cosmos, which is displayed, outworked, epitomized in the Christ event.
I wouldn't disagree with that at all, and I'm probably a closet or not so closet Christian. Some people, mainly evangelicals, have loved my work, but written to me saying, "But there's a Christ-shaped hole in that last chapter. Why?" And I have two answers to that. One is that I'm really not entirely sure of what I believe about Christianity. Certainly, some aspects of the way it's presented give me problems, but that's natural. But also I didn't want to be seeming to evangelize for a particular view, since I wanted to bring as many people as possible along with me, people who may be very spiritually inclined, but are not actually Christians.
And I appreciate that very much. And I think you are doing extraordinary work whose significance we will only see, or our future generations will see. Iain, I know that sounds flattering. I don't mean it in that way. I genuinely think that will be the case.
That's a wonderful thought. Thank you.
We have one question in the room. Matthew?
Mm-hmm. The elephant in the room, yeah. Hello. Sorry, who are you?
I'm Matt. Hopefully my question won't be.
Hi, Matt.
So I'm a theologian. That's my training, and so my question is about the concept of God that emerges in that wonderful chapter on the sense of the sacred, and your enthusiasm for this idea that in creation God is entering into a process of self-discovery and developing, which it's interesting because it becomes a very keen part of your argument, and almost feels like for you to sit comfortably with the idea of there being a God. This seems to be a necessary part of the deal, as it were. But key figures that you draw on throughout the work, Plotinus and then Nicholas of Cusa, would have held to an understanding of the divine as unchanging, and that in the kind of fullness of being that the divine is, you have this kind of Aquinas would say that God is pure act, kind of abundance and fullness, that the universe then does progress towards, because it's drawn towards this fullness of life. So my question, I suppose, is how wedded is your project to that idea of God has to develop? Does it feel like a deeply necessary thing, or is it just that's where you're attracted to at the moment? And then I suppose the second question, would relate to apophatism and language. You make some really helpful comments about the way that the left hemisphere tries to use language to represent, to pin things down. And therefore, in apophatism, there's this essentially the prohibiting of that. And so I guess I wanted to kind of flip it and say, perhaps in this modern language of God changing, God, might there be the kind of the flip of the opposite danger to that kind of classic God's the designer of all things, and a kind of mapping of the divine changing onto the divine in a way that could have pitfalls in its own way. I hope that makes sense.
Question about mutability.
Completely, yes. Yes. Well, the first thing is anything one says about God is going to be wrong, which is why I hesitated before writing that very wrong chapter. And many philosophical friends begged me not to write it, but I thought there would be the keystone of the arch would be missing. So there is something definitely, I mean, my answer to your first question in brief is necessary but not sufficient. So there is something necessary about this vision, but it isn't enough. And so I'd like to qualify it. There is a poem by Hardy which alerts one to the danger. I'm a great fan of Hardy, but he wrote a poem called God's Education, in which he suggests that God was sort of tinkering away in the lab and seeing what came of it, and then sort of finding out that he created a world that was pretty awful, really, and he had to learn something. Now, I don't think that God is that. And this may sound like having one's cake and eating it, but I think I would say there's more to it than that, which is that it's perfectly possible for God to, and God alone perhaps, to be both unchanging and in process. And there are even ways in which I could visualize this helpfully for somebody. For example, there are on the internet images of a full circle which begins to unfold and break up, and then the parts break up and they change. The circle with all its beauty is there all the time, but within this, almost fractally, things are being generated. So it's ever generative without that in some sense spoiling its integrity. And this is a point I often make about a flower unfolding. Is no less of a flower after it's unfolded than when it was a tight bud. But both of these are necessary aspects of the flower. And indeed, a further aspect of the flower is that it eventually becomes fruit. So all these ways of thinking have to be brought to bear on the situation, it seems to me. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. Now, your second, you have to remind me again, because the first point was, is it enough? And I think I've answered that we have to have both these things. But there was a second part to your question. Have I answered it or have I not?
It was about apophaticism.
Yeah, it was about apophaticism.
Apophaticism. Yes, I think, I mean, and my answer to that is that apophaticism alone is not enough, but it's a very important corrective for the world that we're in, which is much too deterministic in its use of language. And so, again, one can see the left hemisphere is always wanting to close down on a certainty, and the right is always wanting to open up into a possibility. And this is reflected in language. So language can be used in such a way as to define and to delimit what it is referring to. And this is ordinary prose. But actually, what came historically before prose was a kind of poetry. And that poetry is one where the meaning can never be entirely pinned down, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning. I mean, a great poem by Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Milton, whoever you like, and cannot be paraphrased adequately. It cannot be turned into that kind of lawnmower repair manual language, which in a way the left hemisphere always wants to do. It wants to turn it into a set of instructions. But what it does do is it alludes to many things that are very real but need to be held together at the same time. And the impossibility of doing this in explicit language leads to the use of poetry, metaphor, myth, narrative, ritual, which I call embodied metaphor. These are all ways in which parts of us can be apprised of things that everyday language cannot help us with.
Thank you. Very helpful.
It is very helpful. And Ian, as we come into close,
Thank you.
I think this is a good lead into our final question, which I'll just read, which is in chapter 28, on that the sense of the sacred. You quote William James' letter on the omni-God of the philosophers and theologians, but you also say that God is not in a left hemisphere sense, but in a right hemisphere sense, all-knowing and all-powerful. Knowledge is understood by the right hemisphere. It's a process of openness and receptivity in which two entities progress even closer to one another through experience. Kennen, not wissen, you say.
Yes.
In this sense, God alone has knowledge of everything, whereas we can only have knowledge only of that limited part of reality that we can encounter. And I guess the question is, can we still know, at least in part, in God? Can we still know of or about God, or come to know of or about God in part in this life? It was a question about what's beyond our grasp, but what might be beyond our grasp,
yes,
and isn't a thing to be grasped, yet could be received in some way that we might call knowledge.
Yes. Well, I think God, yes, can be known, emphatically can be known. But the knowledge is not of the pinning down kind. Once again, it's of the kind that comes through, above all for me, through music, but through art and through poetry and through myths and stories and of many traditions around the world, which are remarkably consonant with one another in a way, for all their variety and difference in the reality that they bring us towards. And what I liked about the process of writing the book was that, starting obviously primarily from my knowledge of neuropsychology, but also philosophy and my much sketchier knowledge of physics, that from these three paths, as far as I could tell, we were reaching towards truths that, however far apart on the circumference they came to a core that was common to all three, and happened just to be in line with the core beliefs of many of the so-called wisdom traditions, East and West. So I think we can know, but as it were, in this life through a glass darkly. And there's nothing wrong with having only partial or potential knowledge. In fact, that's the only kind of knowledge we can aspire to. But it doesn't mean it's pointless or useless. Absolutely not. It's terrifically important, but it's never completed. So we are always journeying towards something. And so the encounter that I described was trying to make a difference between the knowledge God has of us. I said only God can have this kind of knowledge. But we can have knowledge in our own kind of God. But it comes from being the individual beings we are, with all the limitations that go with that. But nonetheless, it's real.
Well, Iain, what a way to end. And this has been a treat. Thank you, with all my heart. Thank you for writing this work that was clearly difficult to write. I know we've benefited just from the journey through it, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Faraday Institute, and if Pui was here, so the Divinity faculty here at Cambridge, and from around the country where we've been reading this this wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for taking the interest you have in my work and setting aside the time to discuss it, and for being there this morning with me. And I'd just like to say, I will present myself, you talk amongst yourselves, but if you are happy with it, I'd be very happy with, I don't think anything controversial was said from anybody's point of view, but I'd be very happy with putting this up on my website if it worked for you, because you've stimulated me to formulate more clearly things that perhaps I never have, and it would be a shame to lose it. Well, but on the other hand, I understand you're a private group. I came to you in confidentiality, so you won't in any way offend me if you say, really, we'd rather not. So I'll leave it there, but thank you very much anyway, and goodbye.
Thank you. All right, we'll work that out. We'll work that out. Take care.
All
and
right.
I hope it's
thank you.
Always à la prochaine. Au revoir.